There are moments in a life when the air shifts. You don't hear the change, but you feel it. A tremble in your gut, a stillness in the room, a sense that something irreversible has just taken place. For Alexandria, it happened in the middle of a quiet night, her phone screen lighting up with an alert that didn't just disturb her sleep, it shook the ground beneath her identity. CNN had just broken the news. Senator John N. Kennedy, Louisiana's silver-tongued conservative warrior, had filed an $80 million defamation lawsuit against her. Not a tweet, not political theater, a full-scale legal strike. She stared at the screen, one notification, then 10, then hundreds. Her name was everywhere, but not as a rising progressive star, not as the passionate face of climate action. No, this time she was the accused. And in the eyes of the law, of the media, of the public, potentially the guilty. Before we dive deeper, take a moment, click subscribe. This channel is building something different. We dissect power with truth, we tell stories with heart. Help us reach our first 1,000 subscribers and be part of this journey from the ground up. And ask yourself, what happens when words meant to spark justice become the fire that consumes everything? Alexandria had been called many things before. Radical, dangerous, fearless, but never reckless, never defamatory, never a legal liability. The accusation came fast, the backlash faster. In an Instagram live stream, AOC had done what she always did, spoken her mind, with passion, with clarity, with the fire of someone who believed every word. She had pointed fingers at a system she saw as corrupt, and at one man in particular. He's selling our children's future for oil money. Those words echoed across 200,000 screens. And in one of those screens, inside a dimly lit office in Baton Rouge, Senator Kennedy watched. His fingers didn't flinch. His expression didn't change. He simply leaned forward and clicked replay. Let's talk about Kennedy, because this isn't just about politics. It's about two worlds colliding. He's not a caricature, though his southern charm and witty one-liners might fool you. He's sharp. Educated at Vanderbilt, Oxford, decades of experience, from state treasurer to the U.S. Senate. He plays the long game, quiet, patient, methodical. So when AOC accused him directly of taking illicit money from oil conglomerates to stall environmental reform, he didn't lash out. He assembled a team, he gathered documents, he made calls, and then he filed $80 million. That number wasn't arbitrary. It was a message, a declaration that this wouldn't be dismissed with a tweet. It was a demand for accountability, one that turned every camera, every microphone, every pair of political eyes toward an unfolding war. In Alexandria's Washington office, panic wasn't immediate. At first, it was indignation. She'd been attacked before. This was just another smear, or so she thought. But within hours, everything began to unravel. An internal email, leaked, authentic, devastating. A single line buried in casual language, now screamed across headlines. Find anything, true or not, to prove he's betraying voters. True or not. 3 words that cut through every defense she'd ever built. Let me pause here. Let this sink in. Have you ever said something you didn't think would matter? Not really. Only for it to be the thread that unraveled everything you've built? She had always believed her passion was her strength, her voice, her weapon. But now that voice, amplified to millions, became evidence in a courtroom. And the people who once echoed her every word, some were stepping away. Quietly, carefully. Even friends, even mentors. In moments like these, truth becomes a mirror, not a shield, and what it reflects can be hard to face. This isn't just about two politicians. It's about how power works now. Social media versus law, emotion versus procedure, instinct versus strategy. Kennedy stayed quiet while Alexandria went loud. Another live stream, another defiant tweet. But this time, the replies were different. Where's the proof? Why not just say you were wrong? She didn't back down, but the ground was slipping, and her party, silent. Not in opposition, just absent. Like someone walking slowly backward in the dark, hoping no one notices. Pelosi, Schumer, Sanders, Omar, Tlaib, no one defended her outright. Not anymore. Not with this much risk. What do you do when the people you fought beside leave you standing alone? You fight harder, or you fall apart, or both. As Kennedy toured Louisiana, smiling among factory workers, speaking of dignity, truth, and justice, AOC sat with her team in a closed-door crisis meeting. Staff were scared, morale fractured, and then the unthinkable, a leak from within. A senior advisor anonymously claimed, "We warned her. She didn't listen." This was no longer political warfare. It was an implosion, one she hadn't seen coming. A federal judge refused to throw out the case. Headlines screamed, "AOC's motion denied. Lawsuit moves forward." Legal analysts, even those sympathetic to her, admitted it. This was serious. Very serious. Defamation cases are notoriously hard to prove, unless you can show malice. In the email, it looked like malice. She sold her apartment to pay legal fees. Her mother was hounded by reporters outside their Bronx home. Security was hired, finances dwindled, reputation fragile. In her apartment, long after the world had gone quiet, Alexandria scrolled through comment after comment. Some still believed in her, others felt betrayed. And the worst ones, the ones that kept her awake, weren't cruel. They were disappointed. You were supposed to be better. You let us down. You gave them a weapon. And maybe they were right. This was only the beginning. In the next episode, we'll explore the courtroom clash, where ideals and evidence collide, where two very different visions of America face off beneath the judge's gaze, and where, for the first time, AOC must decide whether silence is more powerful than speech. Subscribe now. The next chapter is coming, because in this new world, the story isn't over until the last post, the last word, the last verdict. And this is just Act 1. The courtroom was cold, not physically, but in presence. The kind of sterile stillness where even emotion seemed to whisper. Alexandria sat at the plaintiff's table, posture straight, gaze fixed, hands clutched tighter than she realized. Her name, her entire identity, was now inked into a federal docket, case number 21CV0418. She didn't blink when Kennedy walked in. He moved with the calm of someone who had already played this game, who understood that appearances in courtrooms were performances of restraint, not fury. The public watched from outside, cameras flashing, pundits speculating, voters arguing, but inside those walls it was different, intimate, unforgiving, real. Kennedy's legal team began with confidence, no drama, just chronology, facts, her live stream, the leaked email, the timing, the intent, and then they said it, actual malice. Two words that transformed the case from a political controversy into a legal minefield. It wasn't enough to be wrong. It had to be knowingly wrong, intentionally damaging. And the email, it looked like a smoking gun. Before we go deeper, a reminder, if you haven't subscribed yet, now is the time. Help us grow to our first 1,000 subscribers. These stories matter because they reveal what happens behind the curtain of American power. They are about more than politics. They are about human cost. Ask yourself, what is the price of conviction when the world starts charging interest? AOC's defense was layered, complicated. Her attorneys argued that she was engaging in protected political speech, that her words were harsh, yes, but allowable, that calling out corruption, even emotionally, is not the same as defaming someone, but the prosecution had more. They revealed internal memos with messages between staffers. One of them, a draft media plan, explicitly used the phrase, "Let's paint him as Big Oil's puppet." The judge took notes. The jury watched closely. Alexandria's mind wasn't on the jury. It was on her mother, watching from home behind drawn curtains in the Bronx. On her staff, fractured and quiet. On the millions of young progressives who had once called her their voice, now unsure if that voice spoke with care. The trial wasn't fast. It stretched on, day after day. And in every courtroom hour, Alexandria learned a lesson no campaign could prepare her for. That power without precision is dangerous. She wasn't on the witness stand yet, but she knew it was coming. And when it did, she would need more than conviction. She would need humility and truth. Her advisors urged her to settle, privately, quietly, but she refused. Because what she said, she still believed. Because walking back her words now would feel like walking back her entire identity. Because Kennedy, calm, collected Kennedy, was winning not just in court, but in perception. Public support was shifting. Her supporters hadn't abandoned her. Not all of them, but doubt had taken root. Doubt grows fast in silence. Online, memes of the courtroom testimony began to circulate, her face in still frames, captions like, "From firebrand to defendant." Speech has consequences. Even truth needs proof. AOC watched them late at night, headphones on, volume low. Alone. The apartment felt smaller now. Legal bills mounted. Even selling her previous home hadn't bought her much time. Her phone rang less. Her team spoke more in whispers. And every morning she walked into that courtroom with a single question etched into her chest. Did I cross the line? When it was finally her turn to testify, there was no dramatic music, no cinematic rise, just a slow walk to the stand. She raised her right hand, swore the oath, and then she spoke. Not to defend herself, but to explain. She talked about why she got into politics, about standing outside food banks as a child, about watching neighborhoods decay while corporations profited, about believing maybe too much in the power of words, and then finally, about Kennedy. She admitted she saw him as the embodiment of a system that hurt people she loved. She admitted she was angry, that she wanted to hit hard, that she went live that night not to start a legal war, but to make people feel seen. But she also admitted this. I didn't check my words. I let passion override caution. And I understand now that in public life that can cause real harm. The courtroom was silent, not because she was dramatic, but because she was human. Even Kennedy, watching from across the room, didn't flinch. He simply nodded once, slowly, as if to say, now you understand the weight. Outside the courthouse, the crowds were smaller, fewer cameras, fewer headlines. But inside, something had shifted, not legally, not yet, but emotionally. Because in that moment, Alexandria didn't play a politician or a victim, she played herself. The sun filtered through thick courthouse glass as Alexandria stepped into the third week of legal warfare. By now, the cameras had found new headlines. Journalists paced less feverishly outside the courthouse, but inside, the storm was only deepening. There's a strange transformation that happens during public trials. Faces you once smiled at become masks of procedure. Words you once wielded like swords now sit in transcripts dissected and stripped of fire. And allies, if you still have any, become echoes in silent rooms. Alexandria had always been an advocate, a fighter. She spoke of green futures, of hope wrapped in legislation, but none of that mattered now. This wasn't Congress. This wasn't Twitter. This was federal court, where intention must be proven and interpretation means little beside evidence. Kennedy's team had built a meticulous case, not with rage or theatrical flair, but with quiet, suffocating precision. They didn't try to destroy her. They tried to dissolve her credibility, one line, one email, one motive at a time. And it was working. The judge was no stranger to political cases. His expression never changed. He listened, took notes, occasionally looked over his glasses with a long, quiet breath that meant more than entire monologues. Each time he did that, Alexandria felt her stomach knot tighter. The prosecution brought forward another set of documents, internal communications from her staff, some months before the live stream. We need to hammer Kennedy on this. Use everything. Don't let facts get in the way of framing. They weren't damning alone, but together, they painted a portrait, one where AOC wasn't just angry, but strategic in her accusations. A narrative not of justice, but ambition. She felt her skin tighten as those lines were read aloud, not because they were lies, but because they were raw, unfiltered, honest in the way that's dangerous in politics. Honesty, it seemed, had edges that cut both ways. Outside the courtroom, the progressive movement simmered in quiet fracture. Activist networks were split. The same communities that once hailed AOC as the North Star of new politics were now debating in private Discord channels, closed group chats, and cautious live streams. Some still stood behind her, armor raised. Others, especially newer voices, questioned the recklessness of her approach. You don't throw accusations without concrete receipts, said a young environmental lawyer in a panel stream. Even if the system is rigged, even if you're right in your gut, law demands proof. The truth was, many agreed with her message, but fewer and fewer agreed with the method, and fewer still were willing to stake their own credibility defending it. Her nights blurred together. Coffee, folders, late calls, exhausted staff, and headlines that flickered between condemnation and cautious sympathy. She'd begun dreaming of courtroom ceilings, of microphones, of the phrase actual malice whispered in unfamiliar voices. And then came the pivot. Kennedy's team called their final witness, a political communications expert not affiliated with either party, brought in to evaluate Alexandria's live stream rhetoric from a professional standpoint. In my view, the expert said calmly, adjusting glasses that reflected the courtroom light, the Congresswoman's words moved beyond passionate critique. She wasn't speaking generally about systemic corruption. She named a man, accused him of criminal activity, without proof. That crosses into reputational harm. The words were sharp, unemotional, delivered like a diagnosis. AOC exhaled slowly. She wasn't just battling Kennedy anymore. She was fighting the framework of political speech itself. The very battlefield she had once mastered now felt like quicksand. Her legal team prepared to rest their case. But one advisor, an older woman with decades in constitutional law, quietly placed a hand on Alexandria's wrist. "Tell your story," she whispered, "before they write it for you." The next morning, without media fanfare or press coordination, Alexandria returned to the stand. She didn't cry. She didn't deflect. She just spoke. She spoke of rage, of watching friends poisoned by polluted air in the Bronx, of learning that policy is often shaped behind closed doors, not in chambers of justice, of the aching realization that moral clarity does not always mean legal safety. "I believed what I said," she told the court, "and maybe I said it wrong. Maybe I said too much. But I've lived in a world where if you don't say it loud, no one listens, and I didn't think about how loud could mean dangerous." The judge didn't react. The room was silent, but something subtle shifted in the air. Not a win, not a reversal, just a moment of undeniable humanity. Later that week, Kennedy took a different path. He held a town hall in his home state, not to gloat, not to escalate, but to explain. "I've been called many things," he said, hands folded in front of a blue-collar audience. "But I never expected to be accused of corruption without evidence, and not by a stranger, by a colleague." His voice didn't rise. He didn't insult her. Instead, he spoke of trust, how fragile it was, how quickly it can turn from foundation to fracture. His message resonated, not because he was a saint, but because he appeared measured, in control. Alexandria watched the video of the town hall in her office, headphones on. There were no memes, no interruptions, just that quiet feeling of watching a man use calm as a scalpel. She felt the weight again, not of guilt, but of consequence. The kind that doesn't scream, the kind that whispers. In D.C., silence became a strategy. The Democratic leadership said little. Supporters in the House avoided the topic. Progressive caucus meetings grew colder. Doors that once opened for her now stayed closed or cracked just enough for polite nods. She walked Capitol Hill like a ghost of her former presence, still recognizable, still potent, but haunted by legal gravity. Her staff remained loyal, but their smiles had faded. The office coffee pot rarely brewed past noon. Morale was no longer lifted by tweets or likes. They needed something real, something grounded. They needed the storm to end, but it wasn't ending. Kennedy's legal team filed a request for an accelerated damages hearing. They wanted to move to the next phase, where numbers turned from hypothetical to real, where $80 million wasn't just a headline, but a sentence. Alexandria sat with her financial advisors that night. "What happens if I lose?" she asked plainly. The oldest among them, a man who had advised campaigns for decades, leaned forward. "You'll owe more than money," he said. "You'll owe silence. Settlements often come with it. And if I fight it, you could lose everything, but your voice will still be yours." It wasn't much of a choice, not to her. She went home, opened her laptop, and began drafting a letter, not to donors, not to the media, but to the people who had believed in her from the start. A letter not of defense, but of reflection. An attempt to reconnect not through defiance, but through transparency. She didn't publish it. Not yet. But the act of writing it reminded her who she was beneath the headline. As week 4 of the trial approached, the nation began to tune back in. Not because of new bombshells, but because something rare had emerged. Two politicians facing off, not in anger, but in complexity. One had struck too hard, one had struck back too coldly, and in between, a country asked itself, what do we want our leaders to be? Unyielding, humble, loud, careful? Can justice be a learning process, or must it always be a punishment? The next phase of the trial promised harder truths, financial disclosures, motive, consequence, and a question that had no simple answer. How do you price reputation? The fourth week unfolded with the weight of unsaid truths and delayed consequences. At first glance, things looked calm, as if the storm had passed. But inside Alexandria's world, the pressure was only just beginning to show in cracks invisible to outsiders. Cracks in her relationships, cracks in her political infrastructure, And worst of all, cracks in her own self-belief. Because the truth isn't always loud. Sometimes it's a whisper you ignore until it's too late. She sat in her office, the blinds drawn, email inbox overflowing with headlines and requests for comment. But none of that mattered at this moment. Her eyes weren't on her screen. They were locked on a photo on her desk, one from her first swearing-in ceremony. She looked younger, fiercer, untouched by the acid of scandal. That version of her still lived somewhere inside. But it felt so far away now. One by one, her inner circle thinned. Not in some dramatic exodus, no angry resignations or public betrayals, but in slow, deliberate silences. Phone calls not returned, messages left unread, meetings missed with vague apologies. Even those who stayed became more careful. Her chief of staff now triple-checked talking points before any public comment. Her communications director asked if live streams were still necessary. People are listening differently now, she said quietly. What she meant was, they're waiting for you to fall again. The lawsuit itself was transforming. What started as a question of defamation had evolved into something bigger, something cultural, symbolic. A battle not just between AOC and Kennedy, but between two visions of political leadership. One loud, digital, emotional, the other calculated, procedural, patient. And the country? Watching, not just as voters, but as judges. Everyone had an opinion, and every opinion became its own headline. The Intercept published a scathing think piece, When Rhetoric Drowns Responsibility, the AOC Reckoning. The Atlantic countered with, The Punishment of Passion, Are We Criminalizing Outrage? Cable news panels replayed the same 5 seconds of her live stream, dissecting her facial expressions like they were decoding Morse code. TikTok was even harsher, weaponizing humor as judgment. A skit of her live stream mixed with game show buzzer sounds went viral. 27 million views. Laughter wrapped around disbelief. The girl who once rewrote the political playbook was now being edited out of her own legacy. It wasn't just the public. Inside the Democratic Party, quiet repositioning began. Progressive stars who had risen alongside her started releasing vague middle ground statements. They didn't name her. They didn't need to. We must balance passion with discipline. Let's ensure our words lift us, not trap us. Subtle, surgical, effective. Even Bernie, her mentor, the man whose campaign she had helped reignite, had gone silent. Her messages to him were received, but never answered. And that silence, more than any court order, stung with finality. The financial strain worsened. Her legal bills were now staggering. Over $1.8 million in just under 6 weeks. Donations had slowed. Fundraising emails were returned with polite unsubscribes. Supporters who once maxed out their contributions began replying with careful questions. Can you explain the evidence they're citing? Is there any truth to the email? Should we be concerned about long-term viability? Questions wrapped in concern, but concern was another form of doubt. And doubt spreads. Her financial advisors were blunt. You're weeks away from insolvency, and if you lose this judgment in full, you're finished. They suggested options: a mortgage against family property, a personal loan from a private financier, crowdfunding. She rejected them all. No, she said, this mistake is mine. The weight should be mine too. Back in court, the dynamic shifted. Kennedy's lawyers now focused less on her live stream and more on damages. Reputation, they argued, is a form of currency, and AOC had tried to bankrupt Kennedy's with a sentence. Their witness, a reputation damage analyst, explained in painful detail. Senator Kennedy was viewed favorably by 68% of his constituents before the accusation. That number dropped by 17% in 2 weeks. They showed emails sent to Kennedy's office, some threatening, some mocking. One read, "We see you, Big Oil Kennedy. Hope you choke on Exxon cash." Kennedy didn't react to the reading. He just sat there, his hands folded on the desk, a stillness about him that felt more powerful than outrage. It wasn't just about oil money. It was about trust, the idea that a leader's name meant something. And she had, intentionally or not, set fire to his. Her legal team cross-examined, trying to poke holes. Couldn't this drop be due to other political factors? Wasn't he already controversial in his environmental voting record? The witness agreed. But his tone remained composed. Controversial isn't the same as criminal, and that's the line she crossed. Those words echoed. The line she crossed. By the end of the 4th week, it became clear. The judge was preparing to rule on preliminary damages. The jury's role would come later. But now he would decide if the case warranted financial consequence before a full trial. And all signs pointed to yes. Alexandria spent the night before the ruling alone. No team. No meetings. Just her in that same apartment, once a symbol of triumph, now a holding cell of reflection. She opened her email draft, the letter she'd started but never sent. She read it again. And for the first time, she wept. Not because she was losing, but because she no longer knew what she had left to protect. The next morning, the judge entered, robe flowing like a curtain before a stage. He didn't waste words. In consideration of submitted evidence, this court finds sufficient basis to proceed with financial review. Preliminary damages assessment, $7.5 million. The courtroom did not gasp. They had expected it. But Alexandria's heart did. $7.5 million before even reaching the trial's final judgment, a number that wasn't just symbolic, it was devastating. She closed her eyes, and in that dark, quiet space behind her lids, she remembered the sound of her own voice on that live stream. So sure, so righteous, so full of belief. She wished she could reach back in time and shake that version of herself. Not to silence her, but to remind her, power comes with precision. Fire without aim burns your own house. In the days that followed, conservative media declared victory. Justice served, read one Fox banner. AOC humbled, read another. She didn't read them, but she felt them, in the stares on the street, in the chill inside her office, in the emails that no longer ended with hearts and fist emojis. She received one anonymous message unsigned with just 4 words, "You taught us better." That one stayed with her. There are moments when silence becomes louder than any speech, when presence alone commands the air in a room. For Alexandria, that silence wasn't empowering anymore. It was accusatory. It followed her through the Capitol, down hallways once filled with nods and warm glances, now replaced by averted eyes and passing whispers. The ruling was public. The damage, measurable. $7.5 million. That number didn't just represent a fine. It became a symbol, a cautionary tale. AOC wasn't just a defendant anymore. She was a mirror, reflecting the risks of passion unrestrained by process, of digital conviction untempered by legal consequence. And somewhere deep inside, she began asking herself a question that terrified her. What if the system I tried to fight was right this time? Her Capitol office felt different now. Empty chairs weren't just scheduling issues, they were signs. Her policy director left, citing burnout. One of her senior aides transferred to another congressional office without a formal goodbye. She didn't blame them. She barely blamed anyone anymore, even Kennedy. Blame had become too heavy to carry. She still showed up, still voted, still made appearances on the House floor. But everything felt dulled, like watching herself act in someone else's body. Even her voice had changed, lower, slower, as if every sentence had to be reviewed by an invisible editor, because everything she said now had weight, the dangerous kind. Meanwhile, John Kennedy was thriving, not just legally, culturally. His approval ratings in Louisiana surged. Conservative donors lined up behind him. He became a fixture on the Republican fundraising circuit, traveling from Texas to Iowa, appearing at galas, rallies, and panels where he spoke not of revenge, but of restraint. "We're not here to destroy opponents," he said during a conference. "We're here to protect the integrity of truth." It was a line his speechwriters probably agonized over. But when he delivered it, it felt effortless, measured, civil, calculated. His legal strategy became a model among Republican advisors. Political strategists began encouraging candidates to monitor live streams and social posts from opponents, not just for opposition research, but for potential litigation. Kennedy had redefined political accountability, and not everyone was thrilled about it. Even some conservatives worried. Had the courtroom become a new campaign trail? For Alexandria, this transformation felt surreal. The same man she once viewed as a caricature of corporate complicity was now being embraced as a symbol of democratic restraint. The cognitive dissonance was dizzying. She watched one of his televised speeches where he appeared alongside refinery workers, thanking them for keeping America running. She couldn't help but remember her own live stream, the one where she called him Senator Big Oil. That name now felt less like a rally cry and more like a scar. She turned to her advisors again. They met in her apartment, No longer a war room, now just a quiet space for reflection. What's left? She asked them. No one had a satisfying answer. They talked about public apologies, op-eds, even a documentary-style project to reframe the narrative. But each idea felt forced, reactive, hollow. It was her youngest staffer, a data analyst, who finally spoke with clarity. You have to stop trying to win the old way. This isn't about clearing your name anymore. It's about reclaiming your story. She wrote those words down. Reclaiming your story. But stories require a turning point, and she hadn't found hers yet. In the fifth week of the trial, the tone of the court shifted. Kennedy's lawyers stopped attacking. They began to speak of harm in abstract terms, of healing, of setting a precedent, not to punish, but to educate. It was smart. Their message wasn't about Kennedy anymore. It was about every politician, every activist, every influencer. In the age of algorithms, the closing statement began, we must remember that truth is not a trend. Alexandria knew then they were winning not just the trial, but the narrative. They were positioning themselves as defenders of civil discourse. And she was becoming a warning label. Outside the courtroom, youth movements that once followed her with breathless admiration were splitting into factions. Some still defended her. They saw the lawsuit as a weaponized attempt to silence bold truth-telling. But others, especially newer organizers, viewed her fall with cautious introspection. A viral video from a young organizer encapsulated it. She lit the fire in us, but she also got burned, and now we're all a little more scared to speak. The video had 3 million views by morning. One night, AOC visited her old district in the Bronx without press or security. Just herself. She walked the streets she used to canvass, stood outside the bodega that let her hang flyers, visited the public school she once spoke at after winning her first race. She wasn't mobbed. She wasn't celebrated. People recognized her. But they watched more than they approached. And in those glances, she saw both memory and uncertainty. She bought a soda and sat on a bench nearby. For the first time in months, she let the city's noise drown out her own. She didn't rehearse a speech. She didn't think about her next statement. She just listened. And what she heard was simple. People didn't want saints. They didn't want martyrs. They wanted leaders who made mistakes and learned. Not perfectly, not immediately, just honestly. Back in Washington, she met with her remaining staff. I'm going to do something different, she told them. She didn't explain, because this wasn't a strategy anymore. This was a return to listening, to serving, to humility, and to facing the question head on. What does accountability look like when you're the one who caused the damage? In episode 6, the courtroom will reach its climax, and we will witness the final ruling, the media frenzy it provokes, and the profound emotional reckoning that follows. Kennedy will make a choice that surprises everyone, and AOC will finally decide what kind of voice she wants to be. Not for her party, not for her followers, but for herself. Because sometimes the greatest revolution is to change within. A chill swept through Washington that morning, not the kind caused by weather, but the quiet tension of something imminent. The city had grown used to noise, protests, campaigns, shouting matches on the House floor, but this day moved like breath held in the chest. Inside the federal courthouse, the final verdict was near. The walls of the courtroom no longer echoed with argument. No more exhibits, no more witnesses, just a room full of faces waiting to hear what the law had decided. Alexandria sat still, no notes in front of her, no pen, no gestures, just stillness. As if by not moving, she could hold back the tide. Across the aisle, Senator John Kennedy sat with that same unreadable calm that had defined him since the beginning. Not smug, not cold, just composed, as if he'd already lived this moment in his head 100 times. The judge entered. Everyone rose. And in that moment, Alexandria didn't see a courtroom. She saw a crossroads. The verdict was read slowly. Yes, the statements made by Congresswoman Ocasio-Cortez met the threshold for defamation. Yes, the court believed actual malice had been demonstrated through internal correspondence. Yes, the damage to Senator Kennedy's reputation was significant and quantifiable. The total, $18 million in damages. A silence fell that wasn't just respectful, it was stunned. No one had expected the number to rise. Kennedy didn't react. He didn't smile. He didn't nod. He simply blinked, as if taking in the gravity not just for himself, but for what the decision meant. Alexandria felt nothing at first. Not sadness, not anger, just numbness. And then a single thought. This is what consequence sounds like. The courtroom emptied slowly. Outside, the world had been waiting. Reporters, commentators, citizens, all hungry for the headline. AOC loses defamation case, $18 million verdict. The news hit every platform within minutes. On Twitter, reactions flew like arrows. She had it coming. Free speech is dead. This is justice. This is silencing. She didn't read them. She walked out without speaking. Her staff, cameras, aides, all fell behind. She didn't go back to her office. She didn't go home. She walked. For blocks. Through DC streets she once conquered with purpose. Past cafes and bookstores that had carried her memoir. Past murals where her face was painted beside phrases like unbought and unbossed. It all felt distant now. Not gone, just quieter. Inside a private room hours later, her legal team discussed options. Appeal, settlement, bankruptcy protection. Alexandria listened, but her mind wasn't in the room. She was remembering the live stream, the moment it began, the heat in her voice, the rush of being listened to, and the choice, the sentence that had sparked it all. He's taking oil money to block the future. A sentence that had felt true, hadn't been proven, and that difference had cost her everything. In Baton Rouge, Kennedy held a press conference. It wasn't celebratory. No banners, no victory signs, just a simple podium, a simple statement. I did not seek to punish. I sought to clarify. The courtroom was not my campaign trail. It was my last resort. He paused, then continued. And I want to say this clearly. I don't want this ruling to silence anyone. I want it to remind us, in a democracy, truth matters, and we all share responsibility for protecting it. There was power in that restraint. His approval ratings climbed again. In private, he made a decision that stunned even his staff. He would donate a large portion of the awarded damages to bipartisan civic education programs, including several progressive-leaning initiatives focused on political literacy and digital responsibility. He didn't announce it with fanfare. He didn't want applause. He wanted to control the ending of the story. Alexandria, meanwhile, disappeared from public view for a week. No tweets, no press, no live streams. For the first time since she'd entered public life, she went dark. Speculation exploded. Was she quitting? Was she being removed? Was she okay? And then, quietly, she returned. Not with a video, not with a press conference, but with a single typed statement posted on her website. I made a mistake. I allowed passion to lead me past the line of responsibility. I believed I was speaking for justice, but I spoke without proof. And in doing so, I hurt not just a colleague, but the principles I vowed to uphold. I will not appeal. I will not hide. I will own this, and I will learn. The message spread instantly. Not everyone accepted it. Some called it weakness. Others called it too late. But many saw something else. Growth. And that, perhaps, was more powerful than defiance. In the weeks that followed, something unexpected happened. AOC's polling, which had cratered, began to recover slightly. Not to old heights, not to viral fame, but to something more grounded, more real. She was no longer an icon. She was a person, and people, it turns out, don't need perfection. They need honesty. In the weeks following the verdict, Washington moved on, as it always does. The city that lives in sound bites has little room for reflection. But in offices, on campaigns, and behind private doors, the ruling in Kennedy v. Ocasio-Cortez changed everything. No one said it out loud, not at first, but a shift had occurred, deep, invisible, structural, as if everyone in politics had simultaneously adjusted their internal compass. What had once been bold became risky. What had once been spontaneous became reviewed. What had once been tweeted became redrafted 3 times, with legal counsel on BCC. Alexandria had not just lost a case, she had redrawn the perimeter of political communication, and she could feel it. In her office, the mood was strange, not somber, not energized, just quiet. She had returned to work like nothing had happened, attending hearings, reviewing legislation, voting on amendments. But she spoke less, much less. Her staff noticed, her colleagues noticed. She wasn't avoiding work, she was avoiding visibility. And in a town like DC, that's a kind of exile. The press labeled it the Great Retreat. Columnists wrote pieces asking if AOC's era had ended. Some asked if she'd run for re-election. Others speculated on a planned resignation. She ignored it all. Because for the first time in her political life, She wasn't concerned with what came next. She was still trying to understand what had just happened. Elsewhere, campaign managers across the country took note. New political guidelines circulated. Avoid accusatory language without documentation. All live content must be reviewed within 24 hours post-stream. Engagement is not a shield. Consulting firms began offering defamation risk assessments. Candidates were advised to remove exaggerated claims from campaign ads. Political social media, once a wild west of rhetorical escalation, became a legal minefield. And in this new reality, a strange irony emerged. Kennedy, a senator once seen as conservative establishment, had become a silent architect of political recalibration. And he hadn't even needed to raise his voice. But Kennedy wasn't untouched either. Though he had won the case in the public perception battle, a quiet discomfort had taken root within him. He received hundreds of letters. Some were congratulatory, some were hostile. But a few, a small, sharp handful, asked the hardest question. You say you did this to protect truth, but did you protect democracy by silencing an opponent? Is justice measured by money or by grace? And one that stuck with him. You could have settled. Why didn't you? At first, he dismissed them. People didn't understand the legal reality. They didn't know the implications of what she said. They didn't see how easily reputations could be destroyed in a single clip. But in quieter moments, he began to wonder, did I defend the principle, or did I set a precedent I'll regret? Alexandria's own reckoning unfolded more slowly. She began holding closed-door sessions with young activists, not as a leader, not as an icon, but as a participant. They didn't ask her to speak, and she didn't volunteer to, until one session, in a Brooklyn basement co-op, a girl with tears in her eyes simply said, I believed in you so much, and I still do, but I'm scared now. I'm scared to say the wrong thing. That was the moment, not the ruling, not the headlines. That girl. Alexandria nodded slowly, and for the first time in months, she found her voice again. Then it's my job to learn and to make sure you don't carry my consequences. She began to write, not tweets, not threads, not official statements, essays, long-form reflections, private journals. She started to frame her experience not as a fall, but as a curriculum, a public leader's guide to surviving failure. Not how to avoid mistakes, but how to navigate them when they arrive. Because they always do. Her transformation wasn't public, not yet. But inside her, something had shifted. Not her ideals, not her politics, her posture. She no longer stood to be seen. She stood to listen. She quietly stepped down from several committee leadership roles. Not forced, voluntary. I want to spend more time in my district. It wasn't spin, it was truth. She spent long afternoons visiting housing projects, environmental clinics, youth programs. She sat with people again, eye to eye, no microphones, and slowly people began to talk to her differently, not as a star, as a person. Kennedy, too, found himself at a crossroads. The legal victory had elevated him. Donors poured in. Media attention surged. But in private, he had begun visiting schools, civic centers, talking less about AOC and more about discourse. He started using her name sparingly. Not as a villain, but as a case study. We disagreed. She said something wrong. I responded with law. That's the surface story. But beneath it, there's a bigger lesson about how we talk across the aisle. His tone had changed. He had won by law. But he didn't want history to remember him only as a victor. He wanted to be remembered as a reformer. And the only way to earn that was to grow too. The media, always hungry for conflict, struggled to maintain interest. With no more courtrooms, no more viral clips, the narrative faded. What replaced it wasn't scandal, it was complexity. And complexity doesn't trend. But for those watching closely, something was happening. Alexandria began collaborating with opponents on smaller, less visible bills, infrastructure, housing, student loan negotiations, quiet victories built brick by brick. She stopped chasing fire. She started planting roots. By 2026, the American political climate had shifted again, as it always does. But this time, the change wasn't loud. It wasn't defined by uprisings or scandals. It was deeper, quieter, built on choices made 2 years earlier, when the courtroom gavel fell and reshaped what it meant to speak in politics. New candidates emerged, some barely old enough to remember Obama's first election. They weren't carbon copies of their predecessors. They were products of a changed environment, one where every word had weight, where digital memory was forever, and where the consequences of missteps were measured in millions. The Kennedy AOC trial had become more than a case. It had become curriculum. At campaign schools across the country, consultants referenced it not as history, but as warning. What you say isn't just opinion anymore. One instructor told a room full of city council hopefuls, it's legal posture, it's precedent, it's a potential liability. The new generation listened, not with fear, but with precision. In California, a young progressive named Layla Mendez launched her congressional campaign by vowing to combine AOC's passion with post-litigation clarity. I'm here to speak boldly and prove it completely, she said at her kickoff rally. The crowd roared. In Texas, a Republican challenger used Kennedy's journey as part of his campaign branding. Say what you want, but back it up, just like Kennedy did. Posters with the tagline, "Truth Trends," lined the highways outside Austin. These weren't isolated incidents. They were echoes, ripples from a conflict neither Kennedy nor Alexandria had anticipated would outlast them. Inside AOC's office, things had stabilized, but at a lower altitude. Gone were the viral campaigns and massive fundraising spikes. What remained was quieter. Neighborhood meetings, committee negotiations, policy reports. She had transformed from a movement into an institution. Not flashy, but reliable. And that change wasn't accidental. It was necessary. She no longer sought to lead with fire. She led with form. Her staff had changed too. Newer, younger, more cautious. They didn't idolize her. They worked with her. She appreciated that more than she admitted. Meanwhile, John Kennedy took on a new role, not through appointment, but through momentum. He became the de facto voice of legal boundaries in public discourse. Invited to universities, think tanks, and media panels, he delivered lectures titled Freedom and Responsibility in the Digital Era. He was no longer just a senator. He had become a symbol. But even symbols feel weight. In private, Kennedy grew more introspective. He watched clips from the trial, not for vindication, but understanding. And when asked in a quiet moment if he would do it again, he paused for the first time. Maybe, but differently. The media tried to reignite the rivalry. A CNN panel asked, is AOC still a political threat to conservatives? Fox countered, is Kennedy the next big voice for restraint in the GOP? But neither Alexandria nor Kennedy responded. They had moved on, not from each other, but from the storyline. They knew their legacies wouldn't be defined by a single verdict. They would be shaped by how they carried it. The midterm energy began to rise in early spring. Town halls buzzed with hopefuls trying to find their footing in a cautious but energized electorate. Voters were tired of extremism, but wary of blandness. They wanted leaders who could speak truth, but survive it. Alexandria launched her campaign without flair. No launch video, no celebrity endorsements, just a walking tour through her district. She shook hands. She listened. She didn't promise transformation. She promised commitment. And that landed differently. A mother outside a Bronx school said it best to a local reporter, she's grown. She's not perfect, but she's still here. Sometimes survival is its own message. Kennedy endorsed several younger candidates, but didn't campaign aggressively. He chose instead to mentor quietly, offering behind-the-scenes advice on speechwriting, policy framing, and the legal implications of political attacks. He became a sought-after strategist, not for political warfare, but for damage prevention. Some criticized this pivot. He sued his way to sainthood, one columnist wrote. But Kennedy didn't respond. His belief in restraint had become personal, and belief, once internalized, becomes self-regulating. By the summer of 2026, both Kennedy and Alexandria had accepted what most politicians never do. The spotlight doesn't last. But legacy, that's built in the shadows, long after the applause fades. Alexandria began mentoring too, not with lessons in campaigning, but in accountability. She met with rising leaders from Detroit, Phoenix, and Newark. She listened to them, told them not what to say, but what not to assume. Conviction is a strength, she said. But if it disconnects from evidence, it becomes your weakness. I learned that the hard way. They listened. And in that listening, a new kind of leadership was forming, not built on slogans, built on scars. Light edits only for clarity and flow. The ballots had barely dropped when the air thickened with tension. The 2026 midterms weren't branded with slogans like hope or change. This time, The theme was restraint, quiet campaigns, carefully worded ads, candidates walking a narrow ridge between boldness and caution. In many districts, the Kennedy AOC lawsuit wasn't mentioned, but it was everywhere. In how platforms were crafted, how candidates spoke, how journalists framed every slip of the tongue. You could feel it in debates. Answers felt measured, responses polished, too polished. The electorate noticed. They missed the passion, the fire. But they also feared recklessness. They wanted courage, but with evidence. Ideas, but with realism. It was a new formula, and few had mastered it. In New York's 14th district, Alexandria stood for re-election. She did so with far less noise than in 2018, 2020, or 2022. There were no viral ads, no sweeping endorsements. She had learned. She knocked on doors, sat in school auditoriums, took questions on local infrastructure, housing, clean air and urban corridors. Not once did she mention Kennedy. Not once did she reference the trial. But voters remembered. She could feel it in the questions. What's changed for you since the lawsuit? How do you lead after a mistake like that? And one older voter put it plainly. You've always had passion. Now I want to know if you have patience. Her answers weren't flashy. I've learned. I've listened. I still believe what I believe. But I know belief alone isn't enough. And somehow that landed. Across the country, Kennedy kept a low profile. He was up for re-election in 2028, not 2026, but his influence was unmistakable. He appeared in carefully selected campaign ads for young conservatives who framed themselves not as fighters, but as stewards. We don't need stars, we need structure, one ad read, showing Kennedy walking with a clipboard, flanked by local officials. His name became shorthand for control, credibility, and conservative calm. And in districts that had grown weary of spectacle, it worked, but not everywhere. In Oregon, a young progressive named Kareem Dawes shocked national observers by flipping a historically red district. His strategy? Honesty over polish. He referenced AOC's lawsuit in his campaign, but not as a criticism. She made a mistake, but she owned it. And she's still here. That's what leadership looks like. The clip went viral, not for its flash, but for its clarity. Voters responded. Election night 2026 was not a blue wave, nor was it a red resurgence. It was a night of balance, of accountability, of transitions. In the final hours, results trickled in. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez held her seat, narrower margin, but she held. It wasn't a victory speech moment. It was a quiet nod to the people who hadn't left. She gathered her team the next morning. They expected a press conference. Instead, she said, "Let's call everyone who helped us, one by one. They didn't just vote for me, they believed again." And so they did. Her apartment glowed with phone light that night, her staff sitting cross-legged on the floor, dialing thank yous. It was personal. Kennedy watched the results from his Baton Rouge office. He smiled slightly when New York's 14th was called. Not because he had lost, not because she had won, but because the system, flawed and fragile, had held. He turned to his team. "She survived it," he said quietly. Then he added, "And so did we." The media scrambled for narratives. Some claimed it was a referendum on cancel culture. Others called it the return of the moderate mind. But underneath the noise, something subtler was happening. Both Kennedy and Alexandria had become symbols of what it means to be broken and still serve. Neither had been erased. Neither had been deified. They had been absorbed into the quiet machinery of a democracy still learning how to carry its own weight. The cameras had turned away. The headlines faded, the viral clips buried, the court transcripts archived. And in that rare silence, the one that follows every political storm, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez stood alone in her district office, watching sunlight slice across dusty bookshelves and half-empty coffee cups. The whirlwind that once carried her across national stages had passed. What remained was something else, something harder, real life. There's a moment, invisible to most, when a public figure realizes their narrative no longer belongs to them. It's been dissected, devoured, memed, politicized. Every word they say echoes in chambers they'll never enter. Every silence they choose speaks louder than their convictions. Alexandria had entered politics thinking she could change the world. And she had, in ways both beautiful and flawed. She had challenged norms, empowered voices, and yes, made mistakes. But now she understood something far more important. Changing the world meant surviving it first. The Kennedy lawsuit had been a reckoning, not just in court, but in her own bones. She had learned that belief is not evidence, that moral clarity isn't legal immunity, that influence is not immunity, that leadership isn't loudness, consistency when no one is cheering. She had once believed being right was enough. Now she believed in being responsible. Meanwhile, in Louisiana, Senator Kennedy stepped into his own twilight. He was no longer the hungry politician of the Trump era. He had secured his place, not through cruelty or combativeness, but by executing a slow, deliberate campaign of boundaries. He hadn't sued to destroy AOC, at least not in his mind. He had sued to make a point, and he made it. But even he admitted, privately, that the result had transformed both of them more than he expected, and maybe more than he wanted. He watched his party take pieces of his strategy and bend them towards silence. He watched as younger conservatives began to weaponize restraint as a way to punish dissent. And he wondered, had I protected democracy or created a precedent that stifled it? In the weeks following the election, both Kennedy and AOC stepped back, not from office, but from the war posture. They stopped speaking about each other. They stopped defending themselves, and they started quietly, cautiously, re-engaging with the work that had brought them into public life in the first place. Policy, people, purpose. Alexandria returned to the Bronx for a community meeting. No reporters, no photographers, just folding chairs and an aging school auditorium. A young mother raised her hand. How do you move forward when they tear you down so badly? The room fell silent, and for a long moment, AOC didn't answer. Then she said, slowly, deliberately, by remembering that I serve you, not the news cycle, not the narrative, you. The woman nodded, and the applause that followed wasn't thunderous. It wasn't performative. It was real, measured, earned. Kennedy, on the other side of the country, visited a high school civics class. He stood in front of teenagers raised on YouTube and TikTok, many of whom had only seen his name on memes. One student asked, "Do you regret suing her?" He smiled. "No, I regret what led to it. I regret the state of political discourse that made lawsuits seem like our best option." He paused, "But I learned from it. And that's something I hope she did too." Another student asked if they'd ever worked together. He said nothing, but inside, the idea didn't seem impossible anymore. What this story became was not a fall, not a fight, not even a verdict. It became a mirror held up to two sides of the American experiment. One progressive, idealistic, disruptive, one conservative, methodical, principled, and both flawed, necessary. The internet moved on, as it always does, but somewhere in the deep memory of American politics, this conflict carved a permanent scar. And scars, as any survivor knows, are not just reminders of pain. They are evidence of healing. AOC didn't resign. Kennedy didn't run for president. They simply endured. And in their endurance, they redefined what it means to lead after the storm. Not as viral icons, but as people who carry their mistakes into the next day and choose to keep going. That, more than any gavel or post, is where democracy finds its breath. Thank you for following this journey. In a world saturated with spectacle, this story reminded us that grace still matters, that change is messy, that even when voices crack, they can still be heard, and that sometimes the most powerful words a leader can speak are the ones whispered after the applause fades.